Historical Association is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1961 with the assistance of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. And our mission is to enhance the understanding, appreciation, and enjoyment of the executive mansion, otherwise known as the White House. So we engage in a lot of different activities in order to fulfill this mission. We fund acquisition of historic objects and artworks to add to the White House collection. And we also operate this educational arm of the organization under the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History. And so that I'm here as a representative today from the Rubenstein Center and from the White House Historical Association. So I wanted to share this information with you guys, not just to let you know who I am, but it also has a lot to do with our topic of conversation today. So we're discussing different ways that the public and the president have communicated, and the sort of the theme of information, access, and the presidency, how all of those things are related and have changed over time. So our mission to share the White House with the greater public is actually very closely related to that theme of information and access. The photograph that you guys can see here is of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. This is a photograph from 1962 where she is actually going through some of the different objects that she has collected with the help of the Historical Association and some other groups to be able to build out the collection of the White House. When the Kennedys arrived in the White House in 1961, there were actually not that many historic objects in the collection. It had been the practice that as each president and first family moved into the White House, they could bring their own belongings with them and were free to sell or give away many of the things that were in the collection in order to furnish the executive mansion in a way that would suit their needs at the time. And so Jackie Kennedy, a great lover of history and also of the arts, was very disappointed by this, in fact, and really wanted to be able to preserve the White House as a museum. And that meant searching far and wide for some of these objects that had at one time been in the White House in order to sort of recollect them and bring them into the space, as well as finding some other pieces that might not have been in the White House but would have been appropriate to the early 19th century when the White House was first occupied. So she also, in addition to building this museum collection within the White House, it was very important to her that once that collection could be built up, she would be able to share the White House with the American public. And so that's part of how the Historical Association comes in and publishes some different pieces of information for the public related to the White House, as well as Jackie Kennedy actually had a television special that was on Valentine's Day in 1962, where she actually offered the American public to be able to go through a tour of the White House with her as the guide. So that's one of the first times that we really see access inside the White House for the greater public. That continued really throughout the second half of the 20th century. And then we see a real resurgence with our most recent First Lady, Michelle Obama, wanting to make sure that the White House is also the people's house. So what does this access to the White House really mean? You see here, this is a view of the White House as it is today. This is the south view, a view from the south grounds. But this is also what the White House looks like today. This is on the north side of the house. And I think that you will agree that this image here with the fence in front of the house, you can actually see this is when some workers are installing these spear tips on the top of the fence to discourage people from trying to jump the fence and try to gain access to the White House. This does not really give the same picture of having an executive mansion that is open to everyone. But this is not the way it always was. So this image is from 2015, though the first fence was put up much earlier in 1833 and went through some changes over time. This is the fence as it appears today, though of course there are now also some barricades and some further barriers to the physical White House. It is worth noting, though, that prior to our current time, the White House was much more open as a physical space. One of the traditional ways in which the house was open is the New Year's Day reception. This is something that started actually with the White House's first residents, John and Abigail Adams, on New Year's Day 1801. They had only recently moved into the house, it had just been completed a couple of months before that. And this is in fact the first public reception held at the White House was on 1801 with the Adamses. The image that you're seeing here is obviously not from 1801. This image is from the 1920s. This is 22. And you see all of these people are lined up in front of the White House. This line, in fact, wrapped all the way around the block and around the executive office building that was next door. And these people are waiting in line so that they can come into the White House, be welcomed into the White House, and in fact shake hands with the president on New Year's Day, give greetings and well wishes for the year to come. So this tradition, as I said, began in 1801, and with very few exceptions, it continued every year until 1932. Herbert Hoover was in fact the last president to open the house to the public on New Year's Day. It's significant because these people are not given invitation to come, or not given special invitation, I should say, but rather anyone who can come to the White House is invited and is welcomed on that day, up until 1932. So here's another image that shows people outside the White House. This image is in fact an engraving that was done in 1840, meant to represent the inauguration of Andrew Jackson in 1829. So if you guys can see the engraving here, we see all kinds of people gathered outside the White House for what is famously known as a pretty rowdy party that was held on the occasion of President Jackson's inauguration. I don't know if you can see down at the bottom, we do also have some text that's given to us by our engraver here. And it says that this is the president's levee, or all creation going to the White House in Washington. So what our artist here is trying to get across is, of course, that these are all kinds of people who are gathering here at the White House to welcome the new president, Andrew Jackson, in 1829. The lore is that, in fact, the party became so rowdy and lasted so late into the night that President Jackson himself chose to sneak out through a window and spend the night in a nearby hotel. So I guess one question then is, We've been talking about physical access, right, to the actual house. But is physical access, is that the same thing as access to information or to actual contact with the president? If we think about this New Year's Day reception, the largest gathering is maybe 6,000 people is the estimate. So if you are in a group of 6,000 people walking through and shaking hands with the president, I'm not sure that that's really a deep level of interaction that you're able to have. If we look back at the founding documents that lay out what the job of the president is in Article 2, several different duties are listed, but there's in fact nothing in those documents about how the president himself will interact with the public. It was not something that the founders really imagined happening. There's much about how the president will interact with the legislators and with some other key figures that are working within the government. But our founders actually did not imagine that the president would be interacting with the general public. Remember, they're sort of making up this job from whole cloth. This is really the first time that someone has served in a role like president. Interestingly, George Washington also, as our first president, was sort of struggling with these different ideas about what he needed to be to the American public, and decided, in fact, that it wouldn't be appropriate for him to speak one-on-one with members of the general public or to shake hands with people in a crowd. Obviously, this is something that has evolved over the history of our country since then. So one of the ways that the president does actually share information with the public is through the press. If you are paying attention to current events right now, you certainly are aware that this is a topic of debate, how our current president is going to use the press as a means of reaching the public. But historically, this is something that's been very important in our country. You see here, this is an image of Franklin Roosevelt. I'm not sure if you can tell from the photograph, but he is in fact in the Oval Office. And all of the people gathered around him are reporters or members of the press, and they've gathered to hear a statement from him in a press conference. This is in 1939. And if you're scanning this photo, of course, down in the front of the photo, we see President Roosevelt seated at the desk. We see a number of different people crowded around. Most of them are engaged in some kind of note-taking. We see from the pens and notebooks that they're holding. Some seem to be having side conversations or smiling at one another. But as you look at this group of people, I think it is impossible not to notice that these are all men, right? That's definitely something that was a characteristic of the press at this time. Again, this is in 1939. In fact, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, in reaction to not only her husband's press conferences, but the state of the press in general, being almost entirely populated by men, she decided that as a way to act against this, she would hold her own press conferences, and in fact, she would only allow women reporters into these press conferences where she would share different information about her activities in the White House as First Lady and reactions to different things that were occurring in the country and indeed throughout the world. So in this picture, while we still see the First Lady is there in the center, and she's surrounded by these women who are there as members of the press. They're all gathered together and sort of huddled around. This is clearly a posed photo, but it is worth noting that these press conferences that Eleanor Roosevelt held with her female press corps did not have the same sort of grandeur as, for example, as we just looked at, the president sitting at the desk surrounded by these waiting ears. The press conferences that Eleanor Roosevelt conducted did sort of occur more as a huddle and had a lasting impact of really bringing more women into the profession of journalism and having those women who were already working as journalists be more widely accepted into the pool of journalists, especially those covering the White House. This image here is the press room in the White House. This is as it appeared in 2009 during the Barack Obama administration. This is the room where the White House press corps, those journalists with the specific beat of covering the White House, where they gather each day to learn information either from the president or from a representative, a press secretary, about the goings-on of the day and any important information that needs to be shared about news and events for that day. So this room is in the West Wing of the White House. The first president to actually have a specific room for press briefings was Richard Nixon in 1970. Prior to that time, most of the journalists covering the White House had office space in the executive office building next door, but they didn't have the same kind of access that they could have with having offices and a distinct space for them actually within the White House. So Richard Nixon in 1970, in fact, had this room constructed. Interestingly, what's directly underneath the floor of the press briefing room is a swimming pool that was built during Franklin Roosevelt's administration. The pool has been emptied, but it does still remain there just under the floor of the press room. So communicating with the public through the press is one way that the public can have access to the president, but he also can speak directly with the public, either through speeches, going out into the community, whether through different campaigning efforts he might be on, or traveling throughout the country to support other politicians or other people who are working for the good of the country. But another way that a president is able to make speeches to the public is through the radio. The first president to actually make a radio address to the American public was Calvin Coolidge in 1924, but we really do associate this medium with Franklin Roosevelt because of the way that Roosevelt was able to really harness this technology and make it his own with the very famous fireside chats that he gave to the American public during his presidency. So the image that you see here, this is Roosevelt, of course. This fireside chat is the 19th in a series of ultimately 30 broadcasts that he made. This is the fireside chat just following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And it is in this press conference when he is explaining to the American public the declaration of war against Japan and what might be expected in the days and indeed years to come. So as you see here from these microphones that are on the desk, there are a number of different news organizations that are represented there. So this medium does still obviously rely on these news organizations to get the information to the public, but the words that are being delivered are coming directly from the president to the people of the country. The use of the radio to make addresses like this was considered a huge innovation at the time, and people felt that it was very intimate. For the first time, they were able to actually hear the voice of the president inside their own homes, and really created a sense of community for a lot of people, and a sense of a much closer relationship with the president. So after radio addresses, then we also see presidents move into using televised addresses to similar effect. But then today, let's jump forward to today, or I guess not exactly today, but just last week. I think we obviously have seen a lot of technological advances that are also represented in the way in which the president can communicate with the American people. So our 44th president, Barack Obama, in what was in fact his last interview during his presidency, was asked an interesting question. He was asked, if you could go back in time and speak to a version of yourself in 2009, just before taking office, what advice would you give yourself? And so, very much related to our topic today, and I don't have the audio clip for you, but so Barack Obama's response to this question, what would he tell a 2009 version of himself? He said, I would tell him that you have to spend more time thinking about new ways of communicating with the American people. You can't be so intimidated by the way things have been done in the White House because the communications landscape is shifting. I might have said to 2009 Obama, think about how you got here and spend that same amount of effort and energy touching people directly, as opposed to standing behind a podium giving a bunch of grim lectures. So let me come to you guys for a second. Let's see. And I'd love to ask someone in one of our classrooms there, if you can think of different ways in which Barack Obama did, in fact, communicate directly with the public. Do we have anyone at one of our schools who can answer or offer some thoughts? We have our folks at Christopher Columbus High School.
I think they may have been having some audio issues, so
Okay.
they might not be able to respond, but is anybody's audio working and able to respond to the question?
I'm not in a classroom, but I can respond. My name's Linda Tedesco. I'm a librarian with Akron Public Schools.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. I listen to a lot of radio, and the only communication I can remember is President Obama giving his press conferences, like on the internet. YouTube is big for the press conferences, more so later on in his presidency than the beginning, and his radio conferences I remember. But I don't have television and haven't had television for quite a while, so we rely on the internet. So that's basically how we got our news. And of course, you have to listen to different radio stations to get a different take, or you're going to get a one-sided, depending on if they're Republicans or Democrats. So I tried to switch back from, different radio stations to get kind of like a balanced, input of what's going on.
Sure, and I think that's something that a lot of people try to be mindful of, to make sure that the information that they're getting is coming from different sources, so that they're able to get a full picture of really what's going on. But I'm thinking specifically of a way of communicating directly with the people that our 44th President Barack Obama was able to take advantage of, and that is with the rise of Twitter. So for the first time in 2015, actually, we see the president using the handle @POTUS, and being able to send obviously very short messages directly to the American public without even having to have that mediated by different news sources, to make sure that the message is not being filtered in different ways.
Can I
think what's interesting? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I really didn't realize, maybe I did, that President Obama was using Twitter, but I really didn't realize it, and it didn't really become, I wasn't really aware of it until President Trump. And during his inauguration, we were on Twitter, and I can say it was just so much fun. It was running so fast. There was so many comments. It was just a blast trying to listen to him, and then seeing all the other responses. And now I'm really tuned into Twitter. Before, that wasn't really one of my, social media avenues, but now it is. Now I'm making it a point to be on Twitter.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I think that's exactly what I was getting at here, is that as you guys heard Linda share with us, as she was watching Twitter recently, she's able to see not only messages coming directly from the president to the people, but then the other side of that, people being able to actually respond in real time, and to create an interaction and a sort of a dialogue back and forth. That is, I think, something that actually makes this new innovation of being able to use Twitter or other kinds of social media actually makes a stark contrast between that and some previous ways in which the message of the president or of the White House administration might have been able to come directly to the people, but the people were not always able to bring their message directly back to the White House.
Can I make one other comment about the Twitter?
Oh yeah, sure. Great.
When somebody's just sending you Twitter messages and you don't get to see any of the responses, it's more like a one-way communication, really. Because you can communicate, but if you don't see your communication up there on the screen, I mean, as soon as I type it in, my name's there and it's going up the screen, and it's so exciting. It's so dynamic. It's like night and day just to read them and then actually see all the responses. That's all I wanted to say. It just happened to me like since the inauguration. That's how and it was such an exhilarating experience. It was so much fun. And that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's been the experience really of a lot of people, is being able to find that dynamic back and forth, and being able to see how exciting that can be. I think that's exactly right. Yeah. So I guess the big question that I'd like for you guys to think about, and perhaps this is just a conversation that you'll be able to have in your own classrooms, since we seem to be having some difficulty talking back and forth, is to just think about, is physical access the same thing as access to information? And in what ways are those different types of access the same, and in what ways are they different? And then, sort of as a follow-up to that, do we see that one of these is growing or decreasing? Are they both growing? Are they both decreasing? I'd love for that to be something that you guys can think about as you go away from our conversation today, and think more about information access and the presidency. I should also say one last thing, is all of the primary source images that we have looked at today are from the White House Historical Association Digital Library, which is a great collection that has just launched early last year. And now if you go to the library, you can find over 4,000 different images that have been collected from the White House Historical Association collection, from the White House collection, and a few other different sources. But this is a great place to look if you are looking for different images that show exactly what was going on in the White House and with the presidents and first families throughout the history of our country. So I guess if we don't have any questions from any of the classrooms, which I don't think we will have because of our audio difficulties, then I will leave you with some of those questions to think about in terms of access to information and the presidency. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Loved it.